Mivere poked her head inside, before stepping back into the hall and looking down at the crewwoman, a Helcom who'd been assigned to show them their rooms aboard the little tramp freighter. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, and as he watched, Tom realized he'd never actually seen Mivere get angry. Curious, certainly. Tentative, kind, and enthusiastic, without a doubt. Tenacious and firm, check. Angry? No, not as such, though as he stood back from her, Mivere seemed to be struggling to maintain herself, for the first time since they'd met. Drawing a deep breath, Mivere seemed to gather her composure. "Thank you, miss. Scantly, lady. Though everyone calls me Tinker." Mivere looked back into the day room of the tiny suite. The Helcom girl just managed to glance Tom's way, looking like she wanted to sink into the deck plating. As Mivere sighed and looked back, something like a smile worked its way into place. "I see. How soon until all of our cargo is loaded, Tinker?" Tom couldn't decide what visual clues to look for, as he'd never been so close to a Helcom. Except for the grey skin and hints of scales along the backs of her hands, she could have easily passed for a human, and she looked all kinds of relieved. "Oh, not to worry, lady. Your cargo containers were next to last in the queue, and we should be buttoned up and lifting off in about 5 local hours." Tinker seemed to feel on firmer footing, now she wasn't faced with an exploding noblewoman, and perked up. "I know the ship doesn't look like much, and it's a bit dirty around the edges, but it's got it where it needs it. There won't be a single scratch or dent on anything you packed, and we'll have you back on Shil in just a few weeks. Everything will be safe and sound, I promise. And, please don't mind the captain. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." Mivere looked as composed as she had at the party. Despite any stress, she had the knack of seeming at ease with complete strangers, and Tom marvelled for a moment. Ennobled or not, he had never seen Mivere be unkind to anyone, and over the weeks together, he'd come to wonder what presented a true picture of Shilvanti nobility. Some officers of the interior seemed to be one thing, and then there were some of the people he'd met at Alea's party. As for Alea, she probably needed her own special category. Still, for all the bad examples who seemed to be doing their absolute best to outdo one another, he'd begun to meet more Shilvanti like Mivere, Tanu, and Axia. Of the nobles he'd met, most hadn't been that bad, or at least not difficult. He knew he was going to an entire school full of noble children, with noble parents, but he'd taken to thinking of Earth as their wild frontier. How bad could the heart of Shilvanti civilization really be? "Tinker, Captain Tiernan was kind enough to wait for 2 heartbeats after I came aboard, to ask me if I wanted to go halves," said Mivere primly. "Please thank her for her seeing us back to Shil. However, if she asks me again, or asks what you thought I might say, or even asks anything indirectly regarding the assistant professor, the answer is still a firm no." "Wait, what?" Tom had been trying to look past Mivere into the cabin, but his head snapped back to the pair. Clearly he'd missed something when he fetched his bags from the transport. Looking back and forth, it seemed Tinker was turning greyer by the moment. Yes, lady, is not a word, Tinker, and you can't say what you mean if you aren't saying anything," said Mivere, canting ahead and reminding Tom of his memories of Professor Forrester, before she gave the crewwoman a smile and an encouraging nod. "You've been perfectly helpful, and I do hope that we'll see you in the galley now and then." That is, yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. There are only 10 crewwomen, and I usually pull galley duty with... I'll see you both there." Tom stepped forward, giving Tinker his best smile while not quite interposing himself. "Yes, thank you, Tinker. I expect you have to get back to work, and thanks again for looking over our cargo. We both appreciate it very much. Right now, we just need to go sort our things out and get some rest. We had a long day making sure we didn't leave anything behind before we got here, and you're still hard at work. We'll see you?" Yes, Sir, thank you." Tinker didn't quite scurry, but the phrase all due haste wouldn't have been out of place. as the young crewwoman slipped up the hall and out of sight. Tom bent down, picking up his duffel, and brushed against Mivere as he stepped inside the door. It was a total cheat, and Tom knew it, but it seemed to do the trick. "So, let's see what we have here," he said, looking about the day room. A gargantuan couch built for 4 Shilvanti dominated the room, facing a large video screen, while a table and 4 chairs nestled in the back corner near a pull-down computer terminal. Overall, the furnishings had that feeling of cheap but lightly used, but certainly it was spotlessly clean. Setting down his duffel, he heard Mivere pull her bags inside and seal the door. A water dispenser, mini-sink, and the Shilvanti version of a standard microwave nestled between 2 doors off the day room, and as he heard Mivere settle on the couch, Tom looked inside and nodded. "Okay, a room for you and a room for me. It's bunk beds in each, but they said we have the suite to ourselves for the trip. I'm guessing they don't get a lot of passengers." Looking around the bluish-purple steel that made up the cabin from floor to ceiling, Tom decided that calling it Spartan was generous, but it didn't look bad either. "It may be a bit cramped for you, but hey, a Shilvanti single mattress is practically a queen size for me, and..." Tom paused as he heard Mivere draw a shuddering breath and sob. Rounding the couch as he rushed back, Mivere sat, hunched over. A tear was winding down her cheek, and she looked at him miserably, shaking her head. Trying to parse out what was going through her mind, he stepped closer and laid a hand on her shoulder. No reaction, he thought. Alright, this is bad. "Look, I mean, you never had to try for a night's sleep on a C-141, he started, and she looked up at him without comprehension, and he began again. "I know this can't be what you're probably used to." Mivere looked at him incredulously, as her tears started to fall freely. "You think that's what I'm upset about? I came out to Earth on an Imperial cruiser and this... Oh, goddess! I was so sure we'd be able to take another cruiser back and you could have had a proper room, something comfortable. Not this. I bet this is just one more dig at me from Alea. Oh, Tom, it's your first time off Earth. This isn't what I wanted you to see. For our trip back to Shil." Tom was frozen, as his mind tried to process what Mivere was saying. The notion that she could be so upset about taking care of him was still new. It had certainly shown itself in how she treated him over the last few months. But this? This was another level, and after a moment he thought, accept it now, process it later. Hey now. Reaching down, he tilted her chin up, and looked at her under his brows, giving her a smile. He could never have done it if she weren't sitting down, so he made the most of it. "Look, I doubt Alea had anything to do with this, Miv. Space-available transport means you take what you can get, and we're getting to Shil days earlier than we planned before the start of term. That's not bad, right?" "Well, no, but... "And we have a lot of work between now and then. Planning the classes, right?" he pressed, wiping the tears from her cheeks as he looked her firmly in the eyes. "That's more than enough to keep us busy, isn't it?" Yes, I suppose so," she said with a sniff. "Good. And I promise not to go wandering anywhere around the ship without you," he nodded. "You don't have to do that. I'm not trying to keep you to myself, Tom. I promise. Look, I have no problem staying by your side. None at all," he said, pursing his lips. "And I have no intention of being pulled apart like someone's wishbone." "Wishbone? I don't..." "Never mind. I'll explain when we eat. So, for the next few weeks, Mivere Pelavon, you'll just have to get used to spending our time together," he said firmly, as he gave her yet another smile. "Day and night," he added, as he bent down and kissed her forehead, letting the moment linger. Tom had been thinking about kissing Mivere rather a lot over the last few weeks. Admittedly, some of it was time spent wondering how to deal with the whole Tusk thing, but this seemed right, and he purely hated seeing her in distress over him. When he drew back, Mivere's eyes were wide, and she was so far past purple she was rounding third and heading to violet. Now there's a reaction, he thought, and gave her a wink good enough to cause a sexual harassment suit. "Now, get to unpacking. Tinker said they'd be bringing up the rest of our personal baggage as soon as they could, so we need to get this stuff stowed, he chirped, as he started hauling his duffel towards one of the bedrooms. As he reached the door, he cast a glance backward. Mevere looked at Tom as he began digging into the storage units in the cabin to the right. She felt like she couldn't breathe, even as her heart seemed ready to explode. Still, she did as she was told, and stood up taking her duffel in hand, not knowing what else to do. Is not a word, Professor, he called back cheerfully. After a week into their trip towards Shil, everything seemed to be going smoothly. While she occasionally had to glare at the captain, most of the crew had been polite when they met in the galley or the ship's microgym. After their daily work quota was done, most of Mevere's time in the evenings was spent just simply enjoying Tom's company. A week after seeing Tom's huge box of etched laser recordings, she had purchased a media converter. Working for a few dozen each evening, the mountain of data disks would easily be fully loaded onto their slates well before they arrived. Tom talked with her about what they were loading, going over the curious titles and answering her questions, while she explained Shilvanti things that seemed similar. Setting a goal, Tom proposed they start movie nights as soon as they finished, saying he brought enough banged grain to last at least a few months. Mevere found Tom's presence a delight, looking forward to waking up every day as they went through their new ritual sharing meals in the galley before planning lessons through the morning. Everything was going wonderfully, except... Mevere never gaped. She couldn't abide the thought of standing about, looking witless, yet she couldn't quite believe what Tom was telling her. "You can't say that," she said at last, letting the exclamation hang in the air while she rallied her thoughts. "It's preposterous, Tom. There is no way that Earth could have reached Shil first. None. If you say something like that, no one will believe you." Doesn't stop it from being true, though. Look, the Shilvanti started the climb to spaceflight centuries ago, and we only started about 80 to 100 years back, depending on where you plant the marker. So I get that. No question about it, he said. It calmed Mevere down, as Tom was at least being rational, so after a moment she gave him a close look, picking the conversation apart. "So, what are you actually saying?" "Right. Your people started reaching for space centuries ago, but before that? Let's face it, your industrial revolution was dead slow. We went from steam engines to spacecraft in a couple of centuries. The Shilvanti took 3 times that long." Mevere nodded at that, but countered. "Of course it was slow. It had to be. The line of the Emperors brought Shil under one culture, and they took their time to make sure everything was done right. It was a golden age of peace for our world." "Granted, I'll give you that one, but look at it from my perspective," he said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. Mevere didn't make any sarcastic remarks, but the way she arched an eyebrow at him made Tom feel like he better get to the point. "You had a golden age, and I get it. It's like your version of Queen Victoria took over the whole world, then made it British. I get that, but let's face it, part of all that peaceful stability was because anything the nobility didn't want to change didn't get changed. It made your industrial revolution slow. I mean, glacially slow." Mevere nodded at that grudgingly after a moment, and Tom pressed on. "Thing is, the Shilvanti were only a handful of generations and tools away from humans when you arrived on Earth, depending on which science we're talking about. We were already picking at the theories for a lot of things that are standard Shilvanti technology. We didn't have them yet, but we weren't that far behind. And that's why you were able to improve our industries so fast, and our people haven't needed that much retraining. It's not like we were still in the Bronze Age." "It made it a lot easier than it could have been, but it's not at all the same thing," said Mevere, still not sure what point he was reaching for. "When we needed to go to space, we went to space. House Toyani reached out and established the first noble territory off Shil on our second moon by imperial grant, and we expanded outwards into our solar system after that." "The way I read it, House Toyani put down their flag on your second moon, started mining helium-3 for all it was worth, and managed to beat off anyone else who tried to stake a claim until the Empress recognized them," he muttered, not letting go of the point. After that happened, the Shilvanti expansion into your solar system reads like a combination of the California gold rush and a blatant land grab by the nobility. It was all managed peacefully, and proves we can advance as fast as we need to. It was ambitious, but the Empress managed to keep the noble houses focused and working together, she said, spreading her hands wide as if she was explaining to a class. Anyway, I still don't see how humanity ever had a chance to find us first. Well, for a while, it was humans who had all the pieces in place. Everything from complex mathematics to an early steam engine. Remember when I showed you the Antikythera mechanism in Athens? Humanity had all we needed to break into a full-scale industrial revolution about 2,000 years ago. The universe blinked and things didn't come together, but for a while. If our industrial revolution happened 2,000 years back, instead of 200, then yes, it could have been us who found you instead of the other way around. Mivere bit her lip and ran the idea through her mind. She liked Tom. Well, being honest, she knew she was far past only liking Tom. Emotions aside, though, the very reason for being here was to better teach young noblewomen how the Earth would fit into the Imperium as a productive new member. The human she'd met had been intelligent, professional, courteous and kind. Yes, there were still red zones, but she no longer had any doubt over the panoply of things their world had to offer. Even so, the idea of humanity reaching out to the stars far before any of the other galactic powers was deeply unsettling. Thinking about the idea more didn't help matters. If the notion troubled her, it would send Shilvanti, who saw humans as nothing more than barbarians, straight into apoplectic fits. Her mind thought back to Professor Mesevni, calling humans nothing more than pawn savages, and almost cringed, as Tom looked back, waiting for something. You mentioned something like this once before, and the library in the North African sector? The library at Alexandria? Mivere thought back to when they discussed it, but in spite of her interest, Tom said there was nothing left of the site, so they hadn't taken an excursion there. The concept of Earth discovering Shil sent her mind reeling, and she looked for a way out of the topic. You never did tell me. What became of it? Tom started to answer, then stopped himself after opening and closing his mouth a few times. It was an innocent question, but the more he thought about the answer, the more he felt his stomach tying itself into knots. Christians burned the library down, and killed the last head librarian, a woman no less, named Hypatia. They skinned her alive with abalone shells. Holy shit. What would any Shilvanti, make of that? The thought made him recoil. What that would do for the image of humanity didn't bear thinking about, and here Mivere had just been telling him how the Shil had managed a golden age of peace. Maybe they're right. I've only looked up a few species the Imperium took hold of, and Mivere is just focused on a compare and contrast for what the Imperium sees in the here and now. He thought it over with deepening gloom. It seems like no race's hands have ever been clean, but we're talking rivers and streams of blood. Humanity has made fucking oceans of it. If the galaxy is the rule and we're the exception, maybe we actually are the barbarians. God above, I can't talk about this. It would set humanity back another 100 years if we're lucky. A fire. It was all destroyed in a fire, Tom said at last, before looking back to Mivere. But I agree, we're going to teach comparison and contrast in the here and now, not what if. Maybe it's best not to mention it. Mivere managed to slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Yes, best not to mention it. Tom was reserved for the next few days, and it made Mivere worry. Had she been too hard on him? Humanity had their pride, but they had been taken over almost overnight. Humans had begun to make their first positive inroads to the Imperium after only a few years, and now she visited Earth, she had so many ideas to offer. It really is like dozens of planets all rolled up into one, she thought, before darkly adding a note to herself. That reminds me, I have to have a few choice words with the owner of that human food shop just off campus. The woman has no idea at all. Mivere filed that thought firmly away. While it didn't keep her from brooding over Tom talking less, they managed to finish converting the last of his video and audio recordings well ahead of time. Mivere was looking forward to the idea of movie nights as a reward, and hoped it might shake Tom out of whatever had drawn the high tide over his thoughts. Tom set the CD on the done pile. The box that seemed so full when they'd begun was empty now, and he looked at the inventory list on his data slate, shaking his head at the amount of open memory there still was. Well, that's the last one. I guess I won't have to buy the White Album again. No, and you don't have any chance of losing it. We'll keep the discs for now, but I've linked your inventory to my Omnipad, so that's 2 copies, said Mivere, as she began ticking things off on her fingertips. Once we get back to the campus, you'll have your own space on the Academy servers for storage, and every citizen gets allotted space on the planetary datanet. You'd need to use up a lot more than this before you have to pay a fee, so once we load things there, you'll never lose it. Well, there's that, Tom said, with a bit of a smile before looking over to her. As the smile fell away from his face, she felt a growing concern. Mivere, I need to ask a question. It's been in my head for a couple of days, and I don't have what I need to make up my mind on it. Mivere schooled her features into a mask of interested neutrality, and offered a supporting nod. She wanted to press so badly, wondering if it was their conversation or was it something else. Could something have happened with the crew when she wasn't with him? Had she been too confining with him? Still, Tom seemed ready to talk, and just keeping it short seemed safe. All right, Tom, what is it you want to ask me? Right. Well, that is, I've been thinking about how I'm going to be the first human teacher for the Academy, or even on Shil. You haven't talked about it very much, but I know you had to work to get permission for the class, and for a human teaching assistant. I guess I'm just feeling how heavy a burden that is. It's like that party with Alea. Most of the Shovanti I spoke to were just fine, but Miv, this is your homeworld. Tom paused and looked up at her with a wretched anxiety etched over his features. How many of these people do you think will look at me and just see a savage in a suit? Mivere sighed, more in relief than she wanted to admit, but nodded, and reached over to take Tom's hand. They'd been well past being able to do that without her blushing for weeks now, and she wanted to try and ease his distress. I can't tell you this isn't going to be an issue, Tom. You saw how things were for me at that party, talking to anxious parents or wanting an edge with their daughters. It's going to be like that at the preterm night I warned you about, but I know you're good with people. Tom considered what she was saying and gave her hand a squeeze, which raised Mivere's spirits immeasurably, but he didn't seem shaken out of things just yet. Mivere, look, I remember a long time back, I used to love reading Leonard Pitts, back when he was still writing columns and social commentary. It, wasn't encouraged as an art form after the landings. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot about a story where he talked about the country's first black president in comparison to another man named Jackie Robinson. It went over what Robinson said about how you had to set an example when you were a first, never lose your temper, always give your best, work to pave the way for the others who come after you. This is going to be just like that, isn't it? I can't promise you won't have that, but you aren't entirely a first, Tom. The Rakiri, the Helcom, and all the others had their turn with this sort of thing. Maybe don't think of yourself as the first, just newest and different. Only a few days into the trip home, Tom had grabbed one of the back cushions from the couch and stuffed it onto a seat at the table, grumbling under his breath about booster seats. While she wasn't sure of the reference, she couldn't fault the result as Tom was able to almost look her in the eyes. All right, I can work with that, and just take it one day at a time, he said, giving her a nod and the hint of a smile. He shook his head then. So if I do happen to tell the truth, I hide it so no one can tell what I'm thinking. That's your I'm making a quote voice, isn't it? She asked, feeling a profound relief as he seemed more at ease. Paraphrasing, but yes, he said, jerking a thumb over at the mid-sized box of books in the corner, a fellow named Machiavelli, talking about how he hid what he was thinking to accomplish what he needed. If that means I sometimes have to hide what I'm thinking to be a more effective teacher and not offend the ability, it's worth it. Well, That's the hard part for all of the staff, and I'll stay close enough to keep you out of trouble during the preterm night party. Mevere settled back in her chair, thankful things could get back to their normal routine, but poked at Tom a bit, to be sure. So now we can have movie nights, yes? We've drawn up most of the class comparisons for the students, and we have almost 3 weeks left to go. You don't have anything to worry about besides being your best self, and I want to show you something of Shil when we get the chance. Tom nodded, but then canted his head at her like he was suddenly lost. Wait, what about the actual curriculum? Planning out the class discussions? I don't understand. I showed you the core textbook on humanity. Most of what we have to do is just teach and test out of the books. Wait, what? Tom wrestled with the notion for a few days after Mevere explained, and he picked at it. It didn't bother him, exactly. It was like sorting out meeting the living treasures for Mevere. The idea wasn't fully formed in his mind, but it felt hopeful. Maybe that was it. It wasn't fully there, but the more he thought it over, the more he liked where it was leading him, as long as it worked out as well in practice as it did in his head. In the meantime, movie nights had taken on a life of their own, and Tom was enjoying the evenings with Mevere immensely. And learning she was just as much of a film buff was a happy surprise for them both. Tom had shown her Casablanca the first night, since it was one of his favourites, and had proven such a hit with Tanu, at least before Tom told him about Bogart's gangster-era films. It had taken a bit for her to understand what banged grains were, but bagged popcorn worked perfectly in the little microwave by the sink, and Mevere took to the salt and butter concoction with so much gusto that his estimation of how long his supply would last was plunging rapidly. On alternative nights, Mevere picked videos that were traditionally popular for the Shilvanti, and each night they discussed what they saw and what the other thought about it. It made for some interesting talks. Tom was still trying to wrap his head around fantasy and war films dominating an entire culture, but the more Mevere explained, the more he could see it. If you took a few of the films made around World War II and gave it just enough of an alien spin, yeah. Tom had been considering what to show Mevere after the first 2 weeks, still unsure how much explaining he'd need with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Lesson planning was over, and dinner wasn't on in the galley yet, so it was still relaxing time. He'd been asking Mevere about how the school administration organised classes, when he made a joke about not needing the sorting hat. Wait, I get that one, Mevere cried with excitement. That's from Hermine Patar and the Immortal Stone. Tom opened his mouth a few times, then nodded. Good grief, I'd forgotten. I read how you were doing remakes of those, but it sort of slipped my mind. I guess that solves the problem of what to watch next if you have your copies. As if any teacher can escape having them, she said with a pitying look. After the first one came out, you couldn't escape the things. I think making them all in just 5 years was a record. I don't think there's a girl in school that wasn't gushing over Haldry or wanting to be like the hero. Who? Neville Longbottom? Mevere gave Tom a look that reminded him that she not only wasn't from Venus, she wasn't even from the same solar system. Neville? You mean Nilven? She's only a supporting character. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, he said with a firm nod, before leaning over to pack away their work off the table. All right. Harry and Hermione and Ron are the main characters, but it's Neville who grows the most as a person, steps up and takes responsibility, faces the villain without a magical scar, and puts his life on the line when he has no reason to think he's going to live. Mevere looked at Tom and tried to process the notion. This seemed like some twist on his humans' lives as stories idea. She still hadn't quite worked out how two societies that agreed on the fundamentals could arrive at such completely different views on what was good or right and how to achieve them, but this seemed safe. All right, I guess we do know what we're watching for the next 2 weeks. One night with your version and the next night with mine. Mevere had watched Hermione Patar and the Order of the Flaming Juriel too many times for it to keep her attention. The couch they shared was comfortable enough, and she'd actually enjoyed dinner in the galley. Earlier in the day, She'd even been able to put in a bit more time in at what passed for a gym. She was just tired. Honestly, she hadn't meant to doze off. It was Tom's hand, stroking through her hair and down her back, that slowly woke her up. She drowsed a minute as she nestled into the sensation and blinked the sleep from her eyes. The movie was still playing, and she felt warm and comfortable with her head on Tom's leg. Maver's body froze as her eyes shot open. Tom felt Maver tense up, but kept stroking through her hair. Maver falling asleep beside him, then on him as she took over the couch, had been one of the nicest things he could remember. It was trusting, and stroking her hair, gently at first, had just felt right. For weeks since their talk about being a first human, he'd been trying to figure out how to put a move on her without ruining her trust that he could be all of those things. He stopped watching the movie a long time ago, utterly distracted when she sank down on him, fast asleep. It wasn't fair at all that her laying there let him hard as granite.
Attention, lowly mortals. This one is Gwawan, a cultivator serving Master Jack Johansson, who wishes me to convey a message to you on behalf of Net Narrator. If your peasant males wish to listen to the alien sex scenes and cultivate your chi, then you can find the content on Patreon at the Space Commando tier, where you can find other benefits, including Greentext that won't show on the main channel, and a sneak peek of one-shots yet to be made public. However, if you wish to support that filthy mortal in other ways, you can also become a YouTube member and have early access to chapters of ongoing series. And you can also send Net Narrator cards and items on Steam, whatever that is, using the links in the description. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe and comment on the video, or my fellow cultivators and I shall use our combined technique to teach you true discipline. Understand? Good. Carry out your orders.
The rest of their passage had gone by in a blur, but the time came that Maver had been dreading. True to Tinker's word, the cargo canisters looked fine. Their baggage had been ready. All she had to do was settle up with the captain and join Tom at the cab. She felt herself turning bluer by the moment, as she glared a raw defiance at Captain Tiernan that she didn't really feel.
And that's 500 credits for a new couch. 500! Not one credit less, you lucky.
Tom opened the transport door as Maver finally joined him. Everything seemed ready to go, and he hadn't minded the extra time. The main spaceport on Shil wasn't its size, but its scope. He had the impression of being on an open plain, until he understood what he thought was the ground was all one vast building, stretching as far as he could see. What he realized to be a roof deck to land ships reached out across a wide expanse where transports and freight scurried around a profusion of ships, like their own. Overhead, a profusion of ships beyond anything he'd seen since the invasion jockeyed with one another in a coordinated dance, either slowly falling toward landing or rising for space. Damn, I'm not in Kansas anymore, he said to himself, as Maver climbed in beside him. Everything all right? He asked tentatively. Fine, and perfect, she said, nodding her head finally. Really, it's just perfect, she quickly bit out, as she punched in the address, not quite stabbing the cab's console. Drive.